The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
I would say that their basic characters were formed under her, and therefore her fingerprints are on their basic characters.
Historian Barbara Perry recounts how Rose Kennedy, the mother of John F. Kennedy and his 8 siblings, guided her children through their early years. Coming up, we'll learn about the matriarch of the Kennedy family and even hear from Rose herself next on this episode of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to this episode of JFK 35. Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald was born in Boston's North End on July 22, 1890. Rose was the eldest daughter of John F. and Mary Josephine Hannon Fitzgerald. Unlike many young women of her time, Rose would have the unique opportunity to grow up in a fiercely political family and participate in politics with her father, John Honeyfitz Fitzgerald. Her father would serve several elected roles in Massachusetts, including as a state senator, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and his most influential role as the mayor of Boston. Rose had a front-row seat to her father's political work, from participating in his campaigns to meeting political leaders, including a visit to see President William McKinley at the White House when she was just 7 years old. Rose would meet and marry aspiring businessman Joseph P. Kennedy on October 7, 1914. The wedding was a modest ceremony at a small chapel officiated by Cardinal William O'Connell. The wedding would be the start of a political dynasty that would last through the 20th century. Today, we take a closer look at the mother of that family, Rose Kennedy, and how she raised a family dedicated to public service and working for the greater good. We'll begin this episode with a look where the family started, a 3-bedroom home in the Brookline suburb just outside of Boston. In this unassuming house, the first 4 of 9 children would be born, including the future President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. I had the chance to visit JFK's birthplace, now a National Historic Site run by the National Park Service.
All right, we'll head on inside.
On a warm and sunny Friday afternoon, I was greeted by National Park Ranger Gabby Hornbeck at the John Fitzgerald Kennedy birthplace. On walking into the home, you are greeted by a large central carpeted staircase with rooms to either side.
So currently, we walked in through the front door. When you walked in, you may have been greeted by one of the 2 domestic servants who worked in the home, Mary O'Donoghue or Alice Michelin.
Hornbeck shows me to the dining room, the first room she brings visitors to.
Now, the dining room of the home is the space where you might say we have the most pieces original to when the Kennedy family lived here, because the site was restored by Rose Kennedy, the president's mother, and she was really basing that restoration off of her memories. So some of those pieces would include the wedding china on the dining table, white china with a gold trim, a shamrock hand-painted into the gold in honor of their Irish heritage. You also have 2 small porringer bowls, or silver bowls, one of which was recently on display actually at the Kennedy Library during our closure. And those belonged to, respectively, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., the eldest Kennedy child further from us, and the nearer bowl belonged to JFK, or Jack as he was known to his family at the time, and both sets were christening gifts.
In each room, items are placed with precision at the direction of President Kennedy's mother, Rose Kennedy.
Yeah, she was incredibly meticulous. She came into the home with an interior designer who she'd worked with previously from Jordan Marsh Department Store, Bob Ludington. There was an offer from the National Park Service to assist in the historic restoration process, but she said, no, I've got it all under control. I can take care of this. And she did it, to her specifications. And really at the time, who better to say what was here when she lived here in 1917 than Rose Kennedy.
The next stop on our tour is the living room or parlor space. A couch and some other chairs are placed along the walls. Included is a red padded chair that Joe Kennedy Sr. would use when he came home from long days at work or multi-day business trips. He would spend time with his young children on that chair. Also, not to go unnoticed, is a large piano in the corner.
The piano is an original piece as well to when the Kennedy family lived here. It was given as a wedding present to Rose Kennedy by two of her uncles in 1914 when she was married, and this was she and Joe Patrick Kennedy Sr.'s first home together. And she wanted all of her children to be able to learn to play piano, and some of them took to it more readily than others, I guess you could say. Jack, for example, was known to have asked his mother why he needed to learn to play this grand piano if they could just listen to pre-recorded music on a phonograph instead. So sort of that curious personality, charming personality coming out in childhood as well.
The room is quiet and peaceful today, but Hornbeck describes how the room would have felt almost a century ago with 4 little Kennedy children running about.
So it's certainly going to be a very busy place, a lot of children running around, all, under the age of 5 years old. So you can definitely imagine that there was an attempt at order probably on the part of Joe and Rose Kennedy, but I'm sure there was definitely a lot of child-based chaos happening in the living room too.
We move upstairs into a room with 2 twin beds and pairs of chests and other bedroom furniture.
You come to the bedroom that Joe Kennedy Sr. and Rose would have shared. This was the bedroom as well that for our purposes is very significant because it's the room where Jack, or JFK, was born. He was born in the bed closest to the window furthest from us, again, May 29th, 1917 at around 3 in the afternoon. There's a very small clock on the table between the 2 beds, the 2 twin beds that are in here, and that's set to 3 p.m. in honor of the hour of his birth, and that's the case for all the clocks in the home. Rose Kennedy is trying to show us the home as though it's a moment in time in 1917 when Jack was born.
From the bedroom where JFK's parents slept, we move down the hall to the nursery.
And in 1917, what we're seeing here is a twin bed, which was used for Joe Jr., and a bassinet, which was used for Jack. And something that's really special, I think, is that the bassinet that we have is the original that was used for Jack. All of the other Kennedy children of his generation, as well as his children, John Jr. and Caroline Kennedy as well.
In both rooms, you can spot a few religious icons on the walls, including a crucifix in the nursery. In many Irish Catholic homes at the time, displays of religion were often frequent and hard to miss. I asked Hornbeck why the displays of religious symbols may have been different at the Kennedy birthplace.
She really wanted this to be, when she's recreating the home, a place where people could come and get a sense of how, quote unquote, every American may have lived in 1917. So her choice to put religious artwork and pieces in more discrete spaces, like exclusively the bedrooms, as you were talking about, probably lends itself more to that than anything else. But yes, they were a very, very devout Catholic family, as we know. Rose Kennedy more so than maybe any of the other family members.
Also in the nursery, 2 books are prominently displayed for any visitor to see, again at Mrs. Kennedy's request.
Now, Rose Kennedy reflects on the fact that she really encouraged her children to read from a young age, and as we know, JFK in particular had a lifelong love of reading and would go on to author books himself. But from a young age, these were some of the books that he would have enjoyed to have read to him. And Rose Kennedy really loved that her children appreciated the themes in King Arthur and his Knights, themes of chivalry, heroism, and of course we have this mythos of Camelot surrounding the death of JFK and the period after his assassination. The other book, Billy Whisker's Kids, is just kind of a silly book. It's a book about a naughty goat who gets into all sorts of trouble. And Rose Kennedy, in her audio, very distinctively says she did not like this book. She thought the illustrations were a bit garish, but her mother had purchased it for her children. And so, a grandmotherly purchase that she supported displaying in the home because wanted to maybe show that duality of, yes, of course, they're children, so they like this book, but, they're Kennedy children, so they also like King Arthur and his Knights.
Continuing the tour on the second floor, we reach a small room with a polished wooden desk with framed photos, 2 small chairs, and other photos on the wall.
And, some people may come in and they think this is Mr. Kennedy, Joe Kennedy Sr.'s office, but it is for Rose Kennedy. She believed motherhood was as much of a profession as any other, and she, took to it in a very structured way. And so she believed she was managing her home, and therefore, as the manager of the home, she warranted a home office.
On the desk was a box of note cards where she recorded major childhood events and any illnesses or maladies each child may have suffered. Rose was extremely detailed in her role as matriarch of the home.
She ascribed to something called scientific mothering, which, was very intense, down to the amount of hugs she may give her children per day. So she was very structured in a way that I think to many people could come off as cold. But honestly, and she was not my mother, so who am I to say? But I think the amount of devotion and love that she poured into creating a space like this purely for the memory of her children is very special. And I think that's something that she did in different acts when her children were in adulthood, helping them with campaigning, things like that. So definitely it may be a very different style of motherhood than very like a warm, loving mother, but she was very devoted to her family all the same.
On the desk is a photo of Rose's father, John Francis Honeyfitz Fitzgerald, holding his grandson, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. Joe would unfortunately die in World War II flying in an experimental bombing mission over Europe, but the expectations for the Kennedy children were set very high.
Honeyfitz was said to have called up a Boston newspaper and said, "I'm holding in my arms the first Irish-American Catholic president of the United States." So those presidential aspirations were set for the children and the family from a very young age.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure.
Visitors can listen to a recording of Rose giving her impressions of each room. I asked Hornbeck what she thought of Rose's tour.
It feels a little almost stressful to assess her as a tour guide, but she does a good job. I mean, I would say objectively, she does a good job as a tour guide. She tells a family story or an anecdote while describing some of the major pieces in this space. She doesn't mention the domestic servants, for example. We try to incorporate that story. And she also doesn't really make that much reference to the fact that her son would go on to become president. She's really focusing on just what the life was like when the family were here. And as we found, going into these many, many years since President Kennedy was elected and tragically assassinated, there are fewer people who are familiar with different aspects of his presidency. So that's kind of what we try to incorporate with our tours, also supplementing with Rose Kennedy's audio. But she has something which we will never had, which was the firsthand experience and being a primary source of having lived in this house. So in that way, she's incredibly valuable.
Hornbeck says Rose's tour is something none of the other presidential birthplaces have. She says some people still can't believe they are actually listening to JFK's mother.
Her voice is incredibly distinctive. She has a very heavy, very formal Boston accent from her having been born around the turn of the 20th century. So I think that's surprising to people. They're like, "Is that not an actor? Are you sure that's not an actor?" And we're like, "No, that's Rose Kennedy. That's Mrs. Kennedy's voice." So it's surprising to some people, but particularly people who were alive during the Kennedy presidency, who maybe even remember her. It's very moving, and there are sometimes people who cry even when they hear her voice.
And so the last room we visit is the kitchen back on the ground floor. While Rose didn't spend a lot of time working here, her tour recording is one of the favorites of the guides of the birthplace. In it, she spends the time reflecting on her children's activities of the day and what she hoped for them. We'll give the final word here to Rose, in her own voice, as recorded nearly 60 years ago.
We always ate Boston baked beans on Saturday night. Warmed over for Sunday morning breakfast, they were perfectly delicious with brown bread. Everyone had their special recipe for Boston baked beans and piccalilli, which was usually served with them. With all the baby bottles to be sterilized, formulas to prepare, and meals to cook, this kitchen was a very busy place. During those hectic hours, I would put the baby in the stroller, take 2 children by the hand, and, with the dog following close behind, set out for the corner grocery store. On the way back, we would usually make a visit to St. Aidan's Church. I wanted my children to realize that church was for every day in the week, and not just for Sundays. As you leave by the back door, imagine with me the laughter of these children as they played in the warm spring sun or built snowmen in the winter. I would look out of the window occasionally to see that all went well. I hope you have enjoyed your visit to our home. We were very happy here, and although we did not know about the days ahead, we were enthusiastic and optimistic about the future.
Now, joining me to talk more about Rose Kennedy and the political dynasty she helped foster is historian Barbara Perry. Barbara is the Gerald L. Belials Professor in Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center and co-directs the center's Presidential Oral History program. She is also the author of Rose Kennedy, The Life and Times of a Political Matriarch. Barbara, thank you for joining me. Well, joining me from the University of Virginia's Miller Center is presidential historian Barbara Perry. Barbara, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Matt.
So today we're here to talk about the matriarch of the Kennedy family, as many refer to her, which is Rose Kennedy. Rose Kennedy would begin a family that would serve American politics at all levels for more than a generation. Let's start, but how did she set the tone for her children as a mom? Many of those children who would pursue politics, government service, or some type of service independent of government.
I think using a Catholic term that is often something that people know from convents, that she was Mother Superior. And I would also say because her husband, Joseph Kennedy Sr., was often away on business, either when they lived in Boston, he was in New York, or when they moved to New York, he was in California, or he was abroad, that she was really responsible for the children, ultimately 9 of them, in their earliest years. Now, sometimes their lives would be more guided as they got older by their father. So I give Rose Kennedy, and this is why I refer to her as a matriarch, as the real head of the household for those young children. And by that I mean disciplining them, raising them in the Catholic Church, seeing to their health, in things that we take for granted now in most developed countries, and that is things like teeth brushing and dental health and getting them to orthodontists. And some might say, well, that seems a bit minor, but she's responsible for those beautiful Kennedy smiles, as an example. And then getting them really interested in history, because at the beginning of the family's time here in Boston, taking them to all of the historic sites. So I think she starts the children off on what would become their public service careers.
What were Rose Kennedy's important influences in her early life that you think would shape her as someone who would raise her children, again, in history and public service?
I think particularly in the public service realm, her father, the namesake for John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Her father was John Fitzgerald, who had the nickname Honey Fitz, and he would be a member of Congress in the 1890s, about the time that Rose was a young child. And then in the early 1900s, for 2 terms, he became the mayor of Boston. And what I like to say is, by virtue of Rose, and to some extent through the paternal Kennedy side of the family, but particularly through the Fitzgerald side, that the Kennedy children had politics and public service and history in their DNA. And I say this too because from the mother's side, that is Rose's mother's influence, she was a very strict Catholic, very disciplined Catholic. Rose was the eldest of 6 children, so she got from her mother that approach to Catholicism, that devout Catholicism that Rose passed along to her children. But because Rose's mother was more introverted and had 6 children to care for, Rose oftentimes accompanied her father, Honey Fitz, out on the campaign trail, or when he was mayor of Boston, she would stand in for her mother for public events. And this gives her the experience not only to train her children in how to meet an audience, how to greet an audience, but also because she would continue campaigning for the sons, who obviously were running for elected office, all 3 of them after Joe Jr. died. They would have Rose out on the campaign trail until she was 90 years old.
Do you think this was a unique thing for someone of Rose's generation to get that sort of political experience, that on-the-ground political experience that she had with her father?
I absolutely do. And I don't mean to indicate that she was a staunch feminist. For example, she was not a suffragist. She was not out in the streets with banners protesting against the fact that women couldn't vote at that time. But the very fact that as a teenager, she was taken out into the public with her dad on the campaign trail and in public events, that was quite unusual, particularly for a woman so young, really a young girl in her teens. So she had that training and she had that experience that she put to good use as she grew older, and the children, particularly her sons, then went into politics.
Thinking about parenting, throughout all generations, people give all sorts of advice on what kind of parent it should be. I think about the First Lady talking about Dr. Spock and things like that. So I want to think back to Rose Kennedy as a mom. Was she a disciplinarian mom? Was she a hugger mom? Or what kind of mother was Rose I think everyone always kind of curious what kind of parent people are. So how would you describe Rose as a mom?
You mentioned hugger or disciplinarian. If we had a scale, let's say we had a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum would be the touchy-feely, huggy, warm mother, and on the opposite end would be the strict disciplinarian. I would say that she leaned towards the strict disciplinarian side of that spectrum. Now, I don't mean to indicate that she was a cruel mother. She was not. But what I say is she was Victorian. To some extent, the children should be seen and not heard. A little bit of that, in that she wanted them to have their times where they could be out playing and she was not dealing with them and she could go be by herself. So there was that element. But she was a believer in spare the rod and spoil the child. And so both Teddy and Jean, the two of the youngest of the 9 children, tell what as adults they thought were funny stories about how if they broke any of her rules, and one of them was they were not to walk home from school alone, because by this time in the 1930s, she knew, of course, the story of the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. And she said by this time the family had quite means. They had millions of dollars. So she worried for the children, and particularly Teddy, who at that time was a youngster, maybe 6 or so. And one day he decided he didn't want to wait for the chauffeur to pick him up, so he walked home from school. And she was livid with him, and one of her forms of discipline was to put the child in a closet. And so then he would talk about that in his memoir, and then his sister Jean said that one time they both ended up in the closet at different times and didn't realize the other one was there until one of them spoke up, and then they just played games until their mother let them out. And we would think that's very cruel now, and probably a parent would be reported to Child Protective Services if that ever got out. The other thing she did was she believed in corporal punishment. But I went to grade school in a Catholic school in the 1960s, and they were still using corporal punishment, spanking children for what they viewed as an undisciplined behavior. So she would use a coat hanger or a ruler, or in her Boston accent, a ruler. And she thought that this was quite quaint, I think, so that when Bobby was campaigning in the 60s, and particularly as he started to run for president in 67, 68, she would be still out on the stage. So by this time she would have been in her, well into her 70s, and she would be used to warm up the audience, almost like a comedian would warm up an audience. And she would tell stories about Bobby as a child, and she'd say, let's see, what should I tell you? I used to spank him with a ruler. And so she thought this was not only, the way to treat a child, but that it was actually, now looking back, a bit of a comic relief.
And really, for her time, that was probably what a lot of parents felt and agreed with, that corporal punishment was, okay in a lot of circumstances.
Absolutely. And as I say, growing up in Catholic school, I remember the principal was a nun, and she would take a ping pong paddle to typically boys who had, again, in her mind, broken through the discipline of a Catholic school. And even my mother never would have done such a thing, but a couple of times, including one time my father called for me from across the street where I was playing, and I ran across the street at maybe age 5 or so, 6, and I didn't look both ways. And he had a friend he had worked with whose daughter had been run over and killed by an automobile. And he was I think he wasn't so much angry at me, but so scared that, he took a little hand to me. and I never did that again. But again, this was in the 1960s and wouldn't be thought to be proper discipline in this day and age.
So one thing you mentioned in that conversation was chauffeur.
Yes.
And I think it's important to note, as you mentioned, that Rose Kennedy was a woman of means. So she had a lot of help around the house, which I think probably gave her more freedom to decide the things she wanted to focus on as a parent. Do you want to touch on, because she had help doing maybe a lot of the logistical things, or the baby, cleaning and cooking, etc. What were the things that Rose Kennedy, in her motherly role did she really focus on as far as upbringing and making sure the kids were paying attention? What was her focus for her?
Yeah, so yes, she had much more free time than most homemakers of that era when we didn't have washing machines and we didn't have cake mixes and frozen foods and that sort of thing. But having a cook, having a chauffeur eventually, having a live-in maid, these made certainly made her life easier, and also meant that she could, when she wanted to, focus on the children, particularly when they were young and they were, let's say, able to walk by this time, but then she would have one in a carriage usually. So because she had been born in the North End of Boston, her dad had been born there in a tenement. And if you go over to the North End, you can see where she was born, and they were not of a lot of means at that time. And you can imagine a lot of Irish immigrants packed together, cheek by jowl, and no vaccines, no health care. A lot of people died from diseases. So once the family was able, when she started her family life with Joe and started having her first children in 1915, the president in 1917, and they lived in Brookline, which was viewed as a suburb, and they had open spaces around them. She would every morning take those children out and walk them around. She would take them to church, even during the week, because she said, I wanted them to know church wasn't just for Sunday. So she got them out into the fresh air. She kept records of their health. She got them to church. She made sure that they all made their first communions and were confirmed in the church. And then meal times were sacred. So when she was not traveling, and she did like to travel a lot, that gave her, I think, the understanding that, first of all, there'd be a staff at home. She and Joe tried never both to be away at the same time. Occasionally they were. And then they also had their friends, Mary and Edward Moore, who had no children, and they sort of became surrogate parents for the Kennedy children. But when she was home, she wanted meal times to, first of all, be very disciplined. There were times that they had to be there for lunch. There were times that they had to be there for dinner. And her disciplinary rule was if they were late, they started on whatever course was being served. They didn't get to go back to the beginning of the meal. And so she had that discipline. But the other discipline was to say to them, well, what did you hear in church today from the priest? What was the sermon about? What were the scriptures? And she would give them math puzzles. She would talk about current events and about history. So she was, as Teddy said as part of her eulogy when she died in 1995, that she was a teacher first and foremost.
And, I think this goes right into my next question, which is for Rose, her Catholicism. How did her Catholicism impact the values that she wanted to put on her children, that she wanted to, get her children to reflect on and have as they grew up?
She got this, I think, from her mother, this gift of faith, ultimate faith that even in the worst tragedies, God's will must be followed. That's number one. And given the tragedies the family would face, the good thing that she had that faith. And she tried to pass that along to her children. That was the first thing. The second was from her mother, a deep belief in prayer in the home. So she said she remembered that all during Lent, Rose and her younger siblings and their mother would kneel on their hardwood floors and pray the rosary every evening of Lent. She had a great devotion to Jesus' mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so when her sons were taken from her by assassination, she would picture herself, she said, at their funerals as Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the foot of the cross. And then that made her think of her sons as martyrs to the cause of the United States through their public service. So she tried to instill in all of her children that they should be moral and they should have faith. And Teddy talks about in his memoir, as a teenager, he'd be at Hyannis and he'd want to be sailing all day. And she'd say, time to go to the retreat. And she would drive him outside of Hyannis, somewhere into the countryside of Massachusetts, and drop him off to go to a retreat. And he said, as well as in his oral history and his memoir, that he believed particularly in Matthew chapter 25 about helping the poor, helping the invalid, helping the imprisoned, helping the ill. And I think that comes directly from his mother as well.
And certainly all 9 children really took that notion to heart that we know of. All gave tremendous amount of service, some giving their lives.
And their public policy
Right.
as well, and
Yes.
particularly, certainly the president in civil rights, but also Bobby and Teddy after the president's death, working for the poor and trying through Congress to get policies passed that helped people in need in this country and around the world.
This is going to be a very controversial and hard question, maybe, which is, did she have any favorites among the 9 children? Or, probably publicly she loved them all equally, but were there any inclinations that maybe, and again, it's the early half of the 20th century, maybe she just favors a little bit more of the boys because she sees a political future in them that the women don't have access to at that point. But in general, did you think she had any particular emphasis, or did she love them all equally?
I never had a chance to interview her and ask her that direct question, and I'm sure she would have been the consummate diplomat, having been a diplomat and an ambassador's wife. But I think if she were really put to the test and maybe hooked up to a lie detector, she would have said, and she did say, when people asked her later in life, what are the most wonderful memories you have if you could rank them? And you might think if she was focused on public service, she would have said, watching my son be inaugurated president. Well, that was in the list, but at the top of the list was having her first child, Joe Jr. And she'd say, there's just nothing like holding your firstborn child in your arms. And she said this too when the president's birthplace in Brookline was dedicated in the mid-60s. She would point up to the window where he was born in that house, and she'd say, you hold your baby in your arms, and you never know what they will do in their lives for time in memoriam. It was something that by that time she knew her family had an impact on the whole world and would never be forgotten. But I would say that her favorite among all the 9 was Joe. He was the golden boy, and all the children knew it. And most of them, the younger ones, looked up to him, but for Jack it was very painful because he could never rise to the level of Joe as the second born. And among the girls, I would say it was Kathleen. So we know Rosemary had an intellectual challenge, and Rose was lovely with her, as were all the children. But I think that Rose saw Kathleen most like herself, beautiful, vivacious, very attractive to the opposite sex, which obviously could be a problem for looking at her daughter and thinking, oh, I need to make sure she is sent off to the convent. But she just adored Kathleen, as they all did. And the very fact that her nickname was Kick, everyone got a kick out of Kick.
I think this turns, unfortunately, to a sad moment in the family, and Rose had to deal with many sad moments that we'll touch on. But that first one was World War II. Her, like you said, her golden boy, her firstborn, goes on a very dangerous and experimental mission, as we find out later, and dies in a plane explosion over in Europe. What was that like for Rose? How would that first major loss also not just affect her at that moment, but really kind of maybe influence the rest of her life going forward? Because, as you said, we don't know, but we do know she had a very big soft spot for Joe, and losing him in that war must have been difficult.
It was, and all of those, including Rose, who wrote a memoir and who were there on that day in Hyannis when 2 priests showed up at the house. Not unusual, because the family was so Catholic and they were so charitable towards the Catholic Church that both Rose and the children thought, oh, they're just here to talk to Joe Sr. about a business opportunity or charity. And then when the word came that Joe Jr. was lost, the family, of course, everyone burst into tears. Jack, who was home at that time from the war, said, Joe wouldn't want us to be here crying, let's go sailing. But Joe Sr. just utterly collapsed. Rose was bolstered by her faith. And I think until she passed away, her view was that she would see all of her fallen children who preceded her in death in heaven, in the life after death. And Joe Sr. once wrote, not long after Joe Jr. died, writing in a letter to a friend, that he could never get over Joe's passing, but that it was a bit easier for Rose because of her faith.
Interesting.
And we should also add that the family, as we know, started the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, and each time one of the members of the family would be lost, they tried to find meaning when there was a tragedy in the family, and certainly for Joe Jr.'s death, to found the foundation in his name, first to help poverty-stricken children, and then later on to be the basis for helping those with intellectual challenges.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about a couple more of those challenges. But before I get to that, I do want to ask, expectation-wise, because of the century they were in, do you think Rose had more expectations of her sons than daughters when it came to public life, leadership, role in politics, things like that? And what were the expectations for the two, men and women in her family, male and female children, going into that? 'Cause she wanted them to be in public life, but again, there were certain barriers for the women in her family.
There were barriers, just as there would have been for Rose. Rose could never have anticipated that she could run for office, and I think the women felt the same in the family. Now, it is often said that Eunice Kennedy Shriver was probably the best politician of the whole group, and that she would have been great in running for elective office. It was not to be at that time, and I don't think Rose ever had any anticipation of that. But because Rose had grown up watching her father, and in that sense, once removed, being in the public eye, I think she saw that for her daughters in the charitable realm, in the fact that they would, in her mind, they would follow in her footsteps, and they would become good wives and good mothers and good Catholic women and good Catholic mothers. I think that's what she foresaw for the girls as they grew into womanhood. And for the boys, by the time that career started to be an issue, that's that breaking point, I think, where Joe Sr. really takes over in pushing the boys into their schooling, pushing the boys into Harvard, pushing them towards political careers, particularly for Joe Jr. And in fact, when Joe Jr. was born in 1915, his grandfather, Honey Fitz, said, he'll be the first Catholic president of the United States. So once again, in the DNA and in the Irish Catholic pride of that family.
Really interesting. And when we get to the girls, I do think we can't overlook this moment is, Rosemary, the third child and the eldest daughter, had what today would be referred to as an intellectual disability. In a family that is so competitive and so focused, how did Rose handle Rosemary, who obviously, because of her intellectual disability, wouldn't have the same chance to, maybe achieve in the way that her siblings would have that chance?
I give Rose so much credit because at the time when she and her husband were told that Rosemary had a low IQ and that they would have used the terminology probably mentally retarded, and the parents were told she should be institutionalized. And the Kennedys refused to do that because institutions for those with that affliction would have been, I think, described as a snake pit. It would have been a horrible life in most institutions. And so what the Kennedys did, we would now call mainstreaming. They had Rosemary join in their sports. They had Rosemary join in their travels, particularly when she went to England with them. She was even presented to the King and Queen of England with her sister Kathleen. They had tutors for her. They made sure that she was not in any kind of danger, so they always had a caretaker with her. But the children were raised to be with Rosemary, to take her, the boys were raised to take her to dances and to dance with her. And up until a time when it no longer became feasible to have her at home or to have her with nuns in an institution because she was tending to wander out on her own, and there were fears about her safety. At that time, then a medical decision was made, probably by Joe Sr., to have a lobotomy for her. But again, I would give both parents credit up until that time for everything they did to try to make her feel a part of the family.
And, that last part that we need to just, again, touch on, unfortunately, Joe Sr. seemed to make a decision, maybe not with all the family's knowledge, maybe even not with Rose's knowledge. I don't know if you can speak to that. But he made that decision to have this controversial lobotomy procedure, which would ultimately make it, it would go the way it did, and Rosemary would then need, real care. The institution that they were fearing and didn't want to happen ultimately, because of the lobotomy, that sort of forced the hand. What do we know about Rose's feelings about what happened, and then how did she try to deal and, live with the effects of that procedure for the rest of her life and the rest of her daughter's life?
It's unclear if Rose or Kathleen perhaps knew about the procedure that would be put upon Rosemary. There's some talk that perhaps Kathleen did some research into the possibility of having a lobotomy. And we should point out that at the time, it wasn't as controversial as we would think as we look back. In fact, it was hailed as a possibility for helping people with anxiety particularly, but certainly not for people with a mental or intellectual challenge. And yet the family thought that because Rosemary was beginning to act out, she was becoming violent, she was beginning to wander, they had to fear, as an example, an unwanted pregnancy perhaps. And there were at times in that era where those with these intellectual challenges would be sterilized. And that wouldn't have been an option for a Catholic family. If she were to have been preyed upon and perhaps impregnated, an abortion wouldn't have been an option for a Catholic family. So Joe Sr. thought this was the thing to do, and of course it did go badly wrong. And all of the work that the whole family had done for Rosemary to make her a part of the family was all undone. She was set back almost into maybe a third grade intellect or a second grade intellect. It affected her speech, it affected her walking ability, and so the family had to put her into an institution. Rose's view and the whole family's view was one of shock suddenly to have their beloved Rosemary disappear. And Joe told the family that she shouldn't be visited because it might make things worse for her. And the family followed that up until the late 50s, early 60s. We think maybe because Jack was ready to run for the presidency and would be running in Wisconsin's primary in 1960, where Rosemary ended up in a convent, that they wouldn't have wanted that information to get out. So Eunice ultimately wrote an article about her sister, and we know from some interviews that Rose did in the early 1970s, after Eunice had gone to visit, and then Rose began to visit Rosemary and take her gifts and things like that. But that Rose, one time in an interview with a friend, burst into tears, which is very unusual for the family, always had a stiff upper lip if they could. But she said she would never get over what happened to Rosemary and that she could never forgive her husband for what happened to Rosemary.
Such another sad moment in her history as a mother. Moving to a little bit more a better story, although it also has a terrible ending. Her sons now, as adults, get going into politics. Rose is participating in campaigns, particularly her second son, who would become president's campaigns. What was Rose's activity like as her children, as particularly her three boys, were going into pursuing public office, and how did she help them as, again, someone we talked about who has had an unusual amount of experience in politics?
She was the perfect campaigner. First of all, she could go out by herself. She didn't need to have a handler, and she didn't need to go with her son. So she and the other children, the men and the women, as you can imagine, could separate from themselves and go all over the country. And Hubert Humphrey, who was running against then Senator John F. Kennedy in the Wisconsin primary, said, "I feel like I'm a little independent drugstore owner, and I have what we would now say a Walmart I'm trying to compete against, because this whole family is out on the stump and they can go to all different places all over the country." What I would say about Rose was that she did have that experience with her dad. And something that we haven't mentioned is that her husband Joe Kennedy, who had risen to the great rank of U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James, that is to the United Kingdom, the first Irish Catholic to have that role under Franklin Roosevelt, had made some missteps at the end of his ambassadorship, which really brought an end of his ambassadorship, and that was that he had made a very undiplomatic statement to some press he thought would be off the record, but leading up to World War II, he said he thought democracy might be over in England, and it indeed might be over in the United States. Well, that was a very undiplomatic thing for a diplomat to say. So Joe became toxic and was really not able to go out and represent the sons out on the stump. He could certainly work behind the scenes and provide money and expertise and all sorts of connections, but that meant that Rose really had to be called upon as the parent who could go out and campaign, and she was excellent at it, and she loved it.
What an asset to have. What was Rose's feelings about all her sons going into politics and becoming leaders, and also, two of them unfortunately gunned down for doing that public service later on in her life? What was her reflections on having her sons go into politics and leaders? Did she regret it? Was she happy about it? What were her thoughts?
At the time, you can imagine her on the inaugural stand on that bitterly cold day, January 20th, 1961. And she would say she was down towards the end of the first row, so unfortunately she was not in the photographs of her son being sworn in. But she was just thrilled, and yet she looked back and said, and here was the little boy who would lose his mittens. So she was still thinking about how undisciplined he was as a little boy. But she was on top of the world, as the whole family was. And yet the shock of the assassination deaths of Jack and Bobby in her early 80s, this would have been in the early 70s, Rose was interviewed, and you can see this on YouTube. She was asked that direct question. If you could have your sons with you now, but they wouldn't have been president of the United States or attorney general or senators, which of that bargain would you take? And for once, Rose was speechless. She looked a little shocked that question and that calculus would be put to her. So for a few seconds, she sort of sputtered, yes, as if she wanted to say, yes, I would have wanted them to serve the public and be president, be attorney general, be senators. And then you all of a sudden get the real Rose, the heart of Rose, and she says, no. And she says, 13 children without fathers, so 11 of Bobby's children, and Jack's 2 children, 13 children without fathers, no. And she shakes her head no.
Which really gets again to the mother at heart. She may have had desires for her children to serve the public good, but in the end, it was all about mother and parenting and understanding the loss of her 2 sons meant the loss for fathers for her 13 children. She suffered so much loss, but we can't say like she suffered loss without all the great things. And her children all went to do great things. I want to talk again just about Rose's daughters. Eunice in particular, as we've talked about, was quite the politician in an era where women were not expected to be in the political realm. They all charted their own path. Some became ambassadors. Eunice, helped found the Special Olympics and pushed her brother to sign laws that would protect people with intellectual disabilities, just like her sister Rosemary, to protect those type of people. What was Rose's thoughts on her daughters, who were all quite successful in charting their own paths?
I think she was certainly just as proud of them as she was the boys. And we should just add that in the tragedy, she would say that at the time she was being asked, particularly in the 70s, there was a book, a biography of Michelangelo called The Agony and the Ecstasy, and that's how she defined her life. And I would say she would put into the ecstasy category, along with her sons and their political success, all of her daughters. Unfortunately lost Kathleen in a plane crash in 1948, but with the remaining daughters, Eunice founding the Special Olympics, making sure that the government was looking into and passing policies that would help those with intellectual challenges, those with mental illnesses, and then Jean Kennedy Smith, and unfortunately Rose did not live to see this, but she would be named ambassador to Ireland, to the Republic of Ireland, by Bill Clinton. And she and Teddy, still in the Senate at this time, would help in the 1990s to bring about the Northern Ireland Peace Accords. So my hope is that Rose's faith was correct, that she is somewhere in the afterlife on high looking down and being able to be proud of those things she didn't even live to see on this earth. But she certainly was proud of those daughters, and she was proud of their marriages, certainly for Eunice to Sergeant Shriver, who became the first director of the Peace Corps and served in the Kennedy administration. He became the U.S. ambassador to France. So that whole family, the Shriver family, has gone into public service. And then Jean Kennedy Smith married to Stephen Smith, who was a businessman and took care of so much of the Kennedys' business dealings in New York, and also was very, very much a facilitator of the Kennedy Library in Boston. And then finally, Pat Kennedy Lawford, I think the most unknown of the women, because she certainly was known when she was married to Peter Lawford, the British actor, and they made their life in Hollywood. But sadly, that marriage ended in divorce not long after President Kennedy's death. And she lived a more quiet life in New York, raising her 4 children. But she did participate in those activities that helped those with intellectual challenges.
Today the Kennedy name comes with almost responsibility. There's a lot of prognostication about future Kennedys. Will they run for office? What will they do? In the public's mind, this family has so much responsibility now, right? Like if you were born into the Kennedy family, by the public standard, it's almost expected that you'll do something publicly to serve. How do you think Rose would feel about all this, and knowing that her family's name is now synonymous with public service and doing something for the greater good?
I think she would be thrilled to know that a whole nother generation, many of whom she got to know of her almost 30 grandchildren, that Joe Kennedy II, named for his uncle, Joe Jr., served in Congress. His son, Joe III, served in Congress from Massachusetts. Teddy Kennedy Jr. served in the state legislature of Connecticut. His brother Patrick served from Rhode Island as a congressman. So they've all had, many of them have had Washington ties. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who is the eldest of Rose's and Joe's grandchildren, was the lieutenant governor of Maryland. So many of them have gone into public service through elective office. Some of them, like the Shriver children, have taken over the Special Olympics. They've started other offshoot programs like Best Buddies. And I've heard one of the Shriver sons say that may not be elective office that leads to what political scientists might call hard power, that's formalized power, but rather soft power that's somewhat more informal. It may be in non-governmental institutions. Joe Kennedy III, I mentioned, has been a member of Congress. He also served in the Peace Corps as well, and now he is an envoy in the Biden administration to Ireland. So I would say that so many of the grandchildren have gone on to serve in this way. And then great-grandchildren, Jack Kennedy Schlossberg seems to perhaps be headed towards a public service career. He's certainly very involved in the Kennedy Library, works very closely with his mother, Caroline Kennedy. We should add that she served as ambassador to Japan under the Obama administration and currently is our ambassador in the Biden administration to Australia. And so Jack, her son, has worked closely with her, continues to work with the library, especially in the Profiling Courage Award. And I foresee that at some point he may run for office. He just seems to have his uncle or his grandfather, Jack's sparkle. He seems to have Rose's ability to meet with an audience and really charge them up. He has degrees from Yale and Harvard, and I've had the opportunity to meet him, and he's just a lovely young man.
And the sisters are also really involved too.
Tatiana, his sister, also very involved, particularly in the Kennedy Library, has written a book on environmental policy. And then their sister, Rose, I think has led the least public of the three of President Kennedy's grandchildren, Caroline and Ed Schlossberg's children. She now, as I understand, owns a restaurant, a natural foods restaurant out in California.
So all thinking about the future of the planet in one way or the other. The final question I have, everyone knows Joe Kennedy Sr., I feel a little bit, because he had a public role as ambassador to the United Kingdom. You know, he was very public about wanting to get his sons into the best schools and, you know, hope that they would pursue politics, particularly Joe Kennedy Jr. He was really hoping that he would, again, you know, from birth, almost like you're going to go to the White House. But when we think about the fingerprints of both parents on the kids, and Rose, who I think had a lot of fingerprints, but maybe, you know, she's not out in the public fold like you're seeing. So as a historian, when you look at the kids and see the fingerprints of both Joe Sr. and Rose, who do you think left more of an impact on the kids? And maybe it's both, but just curious from your end.
I'll be a diplomat and say both, and I also will be honest and say I'm a little bit biased, having written a biography of Rose Kennedy. And if child psychologists are right to say that the basic character of children comes between birth and 6 years of age, given that Rose had, I think, the major impact on those children at the time, I would say that their basic characters were formed under her, and therefore her fingerprints are on their basic characters. Now, you cannot remove Joe from that. And when I was writing my biography of Rose and choosing here at the Kennedy Library the photographs that I would use for the book, one of my historian colleagues, I was sharing the photographs with her. She said, here's an interesting note, Barbara. She said, when you see pictures of the kids at a young age with Rose, they tend to be a little bit separated from her. That's going back to her Victorianism. She wasn't necessarily a huggy-feely parent. But my colleague said, look at when Joe Sr. is with them. They're all over him. They're climbing on him, and he's holding them and hugging them. And that might have been because he was away so often that when he was home, they wanted to all be around him. And I cannot say that it is not the case, to use a double negative, that he didn't have such an impact, especially on the boys as they got older and older, and they were in prep school and college and picking their careers. But it also says why he was an appeaser and why he was an isolationist before World War II began and before the U.S. got into it. He had at least two sons, if you include Bobby, 3, who were going to be of prime draft age, and they all ended up enlisting. They didn't wait to be drafted. They were all enlisted in the Navy, all 3 of them. One gave his life. One almost lost his life in the South Pacific. And so Joe's fingerprints were, first of all, in public policy to try to keep the U.S. out of war. He was a capitalist. He did not want to see the economy of the world blow up, and he wanted to save his sons, and not without good reason, losing the golden boy of them. But I would say their views in politics were, at first, I would say he had the most impact on them, and yet Jack, already at Harvard and writing his honors thesis, was beginning to move away from his dad's political views, as my friend Fred Logeval's first volume of the JFK biography indicates. So Joe Sr. impact for their later lives, Rose for their earliest part of their lives.
Thank you so much for talking us at length about Rose. She's a person that I don't often get to learn more about, so I appreciate the conversation, Barbara.
Thank you, Matt. It was my honor and pleasure. And Rose is such a character, but also such a great political matriarch in our country's history. I hope people will learn more about her.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you for listening to our episode today. If you're interested in learning more about Rose Kennedy and her life raising her children, including President John F. Kennedy, the Library Archives has a multitude of resources. On our podcast page for this episode, we'll have links to photos of Rose with her children, information about the birthplace in Brookline, and more information about Rose's biography. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.